10th of April 2010. A date that no Pole should let pass unnoticed. 7:27 a.m. A government aircraft Tu-154M with President Lech Kaczynski on board takes off from Warsaw Chopin Airport and heads towards Smolensk North Airport, Savannah, in Russia. On the surface, everything seemed to be running smoothly. Nobody expected that this day would live in infamy in our country's history. Perhaps events would have taken a different course had the government not organized separate visits for Prime Minister Tusk and President Kaczynski. The tragedy certainly would not have occurred if Interpol's warning of the threat of a terrorist attack had been taken seriously. However, we were less than an hour away from the greatest aviation disaster to befall the Polish Air Force in its history, and the greatest tragedy in the history of independent Poland. How is it possible that, 4 years after the tragic flight, fundamental questions remain unanswered? Why is the main evidence regarding the wreckage, the so-called black boxes and navigation instruments, are still not in the hands of Polish authorities? Why is it not possible to conclude the investigation and to give a clear explanation of the causes of the disaster? Why did the Prosecutor General not scrutinize and examine the wreckage in its entirety, ignoring sections that were burned and blown apart by an explosion? Why didn't the Prosecutor General scrutinize the original black boxes, or did not carry out autopsies or create a reconstruction of the wreckage? Indeed, why is the Prosecutor General still refusing to investigate the most likely cause of the disaster, an explosion in the final stage of the flight? Do we not, as a nation, deserve to find out the truth? The parliamentary group established to investigate the causes of the Tu-154M disaster of 10th of April 2010 has created a visualization of the most likely scenario for the final seconds of the government aircraft's flight. What we find today in the location where the Russians have gathered parts of the aircraft wreckage, they are in fact only incomplete remnants which have been destroyed, premeditatedly and on many occasions, under any possible pretext. Significant parts are missing from the fuselage covering, especially from the upper section, the President's cabin and the cockpit, which were ripped apart and crushed, as well as the left and right wings and the midsection. What happened to the missing parts? Archaeologists identified some of them 3 months after the disaster. Independent scientists are in no doubt that the only possible cause of such severe damage was a number of explosions. They ripped apart the aircraft, which fell apart into over 60,000 fragments. Lieutenant Rafał Kowaleczko, crew member of the Jak-40 aircraft. I'm in shock the whole time, and I can't get over it. People have to find out what it was like there. Even now, all I hear is that all the blame lies with the Polish pilots. But here at the airport, there were some weird things going on with the handling of the flight that need to be explained. We now know that guidance of the Polish government aircraft was taken over by the Moscow Air Traffic Control Operations Center, codenamed Logika, which was commanded by General Vladimir Benediktov. It was his orders that were being followed by Major Krasnokutski, who unexpectedly appeared in the control tower in Smolensk and took over command. It was he who ordered the aircraft to be brought into land, even though air traffic controllers felt that it should be sent to an alternative airport. Air traffic controllers from Smolensk, Paweł Plusnin and Viktor Rezenko, asked Moscow at several points to indicate alternative airports and to close Smolensk North Airport. However, Moscow refused, and Krasnokutski ordered the aircraft to be brought into land without discussion. Meanwhile, the Polish crew had no intention to land. Given the prevailing weather conditions, Major Protasiuk issued an order to the crew 9 minutes before the disaster to prepare and get ready for a go-around maneuver, abort landing and circle the airport around. In the event of a missed approach, we leave on autopilot. Given the prevailing conditions, the entire procedure should have been carried out with more prior notice from the Russian control tower. Additionally, when the Tu-154M was at a distance of 9 kilometers from the airport, the crew was erroneously informed by air traffic controllers that the aircraft was on track. The aircraft should be guided by the controller along a descent path of 2 degrees 40 minutes. The actual descent path was 3 degrees 12 minutes. Due to the air traffic controller's errors, the pilots did not have sufficient time to stabilize their navigation instruments. At no point were they on path and on course. The aircraft's landing point was almost 1 kilometer closer than the actual beginning of the runway. With 2 minutes to go before the disaster, a series of misleading pieces of information were given to the crew. The tower stated 8 on path and on course. In reality, however, the Tu-154M was 130 meters above the path and had strayed from the course by 80 meters. The subsequent information was also misleading. Continue your approach, on path and on course, distance 6. At that moment, the aircraft was 120 meters above the path and 120 meters to the side of the center line of the runway. The crew of the Polish Jak-40 aircraft mentioned finding the aircraft to the left of the runway. Ensign Remigiusz Musz, technician on the Jak-40 aircraft. We decided to head to the scene of the crash. It became apparent that the site was not 1,500 meters away, as we had previously been informed, but 400 to 500 meters from the start of the runway and 50 meters to the left of the direction of landing. Now just over 20 seconds remain until the catastrophe. The pilots decided at an altitude of 100 meters to go around, stop descent and circle the airport. However, their instruments were not following their commands and the aircraft continued to descend. The commander of the Polish aircraft gave out the order, "Go around." This command was repeated 1 second later by the second pilot. Despite this, the aircraft continued to descend. The plane navigator read out the distance of the approaching ground and the TAWS alarm started to sound. Pull up. After reaching 30 meters above runway level, the pilot manually pulled up the machine. The aircraft then reached 20 meters before finally starting to pull up as part of a going around and abort of landing procedure. When the Tu-154M passed the nearest radio beacon, a series of shocks occurred that were caused by an explosion on the wing. The aircraft started to veer dangerously to the left. The following shocks destabilized the aircraft and the damaged engines started to cut out and interrupt, causing the aircraft to rapidly lose altitude. As a result of the damage, the aircraft veered more pronouncedly, while the remains of the ring and the stabilizer crashed into trees, as well as onto roofs of garages and huts, causing further damage. This is how that moment was described by the air traffic controllers who had, at that very moment, lost the Polish Tu-154M from sight. "Where is it?" asked Krasnokutski. "It just flew past the nearby radio beacon. It will be on the left. It started to pull up to make another approach and then fell." Anatoly Zuyev, witness. "We were standing on the edge of the garage. We could not see anything. No aeroplane. Nothing. The sound of the aeroplane was rather flat, beautiful and soft. I went off to take a look, but I could not see it. Suddenly the motors roared as much as they could and the aeroplane held together as best it could. It flew on like that for a moment, passing us in a flash. Then there was an explosion, yellow, like the yolk of an egg. It was round, and that was it." Sergei Vandarov, witness, owner of a detached house. "This day will remain in my memory until the end of my days. I saw the disaster with my own eyes. It occurred right in front of my house. I lived barely 400 meters from the site of the disaster. That Saturday morning, I was in front of the house when I suddenly heard a terrible rumbling sound. An aircraft appeared in the foggy sky. An aircraft like any other, I thought. Given that I live just a few hundred meters from the airport, I've been able to get used to such a sight. However, there was one thing that stunned me. At a certain moment, the roar simply disappeared. Literally, for a split second, there was an eerie silence above the forest. I turned my head and saw a falling aeroplane. My legs gave way beneath me. A moment later, there was an awful roar, and the glow of a fire appeared among the trees. I cannot believe what happened. I particularly cannot believe that the tragedy took place before my very eyes. The Tu-154M was passing the Gubenko highway. It was here that the end of the left wing fell off after being damaged during the explosion. It was found less than 20 meters away on the ground. A hail of fragments struck nearby trees, fences and hut roofs. Fragments also struck the stabilizer. The aeroplane's left engine was also damaged. Igor Fomin, witness, mechanic. The aeroplane was making a strange noise as it flew, a loud whistling, crackling sound. It sounded like gunfire. Then there was a thud and flames shot out. The pilots lost control of the aeroplane, which violently changed course. 150 meters from the highway at an altitude of 16 meters from the airport's runway, there was an explosion in the rear section of the fuselage, which caused it to detach from the aeroplane. The explosion also ripped off the aeroplane's tail and caused the stabilizer to break off. Nikolai Shevchenko, witness, local bus driver. It was at a height of 12 to 13 meters when it started to turn due to the absence of the wing. It struck a tree, which caused it to straighten out. It flew over the road and then something fell off it, a part of the tail. It then struck the ground just beyond the road. Marif Ipatov, witness. I saw the aeroplane flying away. It was going so low and it fell apart, it lurched. I noticed that something serious was happening. It was creaking, creaking. Then there was a noise like a bomb. Lieutenant Rafał Kowaleczko, crew member of the Yak-40 aircraft. Once we had landed, some of us stood by the airport's runway and waited for the Tu-154M. The pilots returned to the aeroplane and communicated with the crew of the presidential aircraft over the radio. They learned from us that there was fog and that the conditions were bad. However, they did not panic. Less than 20 minutes later, we heard the sound of the Tu-154M approaching the airport. Initially, the sound was completely normal and the engine was running normally. At a certain moment, though, there was a bang from the engine similar to the sound made when the engine starts up. We knew immediately that something was wrong. A moment later we heard the sound of 2 explosions, followed by some thuds. Then everything went silent. We were terrified, as we knew that a disaster had occurred. Once the rear section of the fuselage had exploded and the tail had been ripped off, another explosion occurred that completely destroyed the aeroplane. The center section of the wing and the fuselage were destroyed and fell in an inverted position. The fuselage lining was totally ripped apart, in particular the president's cabin and the cockpit, most of which was never found. The parts that were saved struck the ground in a normal position. Ensign Remigiusz Musz, technician on the Yak-40 aircraft. We left the aeroplane to look for the Tupolev. The weather and the visibility deteriorated further. I returned to the aeroplane and broadcasted, "Arek, visibility is at 200 over the radio." He responded by saying thanks. I then returned before the aeroplane. Several minutes later we heard the characteristic whistling sound of the Tupolev engines, typical due to the reduced number of revolutions associated with descent. Suddenly the revolutions increased to the maximum. 2 seconds later there was some blow and 3 explosions, and then there was a brief sound of one of the engines stalling. Then there was silence. The other torn-off fragments were found about 30 meters apart from each other. These fragments were a section of the starboard of the presidential cabin and toilet with windows, the starboard with some of the writing Republic of Poland, blind doors, the president's sofa. 30 meters from the board in the 4th sector, the body of the President of the Republic of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, was found. Clear signs of an explosion were noted in the form of incineration, tearing, carbonization and sooting, all of which testified to the effects of fire underneath and on the surface of the inverted center section of the wing and the right wing, and above all, on the internal surface of the wall of the president's cabin. As the Russian experts later ascertained, both wings had been ripped apart by a pressure wave from inside, which resulted in the frame being ripped apart and destroyed, and in the upper wing casing being blown outwards. This fact was ignored by the Polish prosecutor's office, the Anadina report, Russian, and the Miller report, Polish. Lieutenant Artur Voshtil, pilot of the Yak-40 aircraft. As we were standing by our plane, we heard the sound of the Tu-154's engines as it approached to land. I recognized it from the characteristic sound of its engines. I should point out that I did not see it. I only heard it. It was the sound of an approach to land at a fixed engine output level. At one point, I heard the engine go into the range associated with ignition. It was as if the pilot wanted to increase the revolutions in order to straighten out the plane or to pull up. At that point, I wondered what could have caused them to take such a step and decision. A few seconds after the revolutions were increased, I heard loud bangs, roars, and detonations. Then there was the sound of the engine fading out before everything went quiet. I found these sounds terrifying, and I hope that I will never hear them again in my life. The passengers of the Tupolev had no chance, and to this day we do not know the circumstances of their deaths. In any case, the time entered in all of the death certificates was 8:10:50, i.e. 9 minutes after the plane crashed into the ground. All of the deaths were attributed to injuries to multiple organs, regardless of whether the cause of death was being torn apart, as occurred in the rear section of the plane, being burnt to death, as occurred in the central section of the plane, or as yet unknown causes of the head injuries sustained by one Government Protection Bureau agent in the front of the aircraft. The body of President Lech Kaczynski was found roughly 4 hours after the rescue mission was called off. Of the 96 victims, 89 were not subjected to post-mortem examinations.
Нихуя себе! Нихуя себе!
On 10th of April 2010, 96 people from the elite of the Polish state died in the greatest tragedy to befall Poland since it regained its independence. The President of the Republic of Poland, Professor Lech Kaczynski, and his wife Maria. The President in exile of the Republic of Poland, Ryszard Kaczorowski. Generals of the Polish Armed Forces, chaplains of the Polish Armed Forces, the Vice-Chancellor of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University, clergymen, ministers, the President of the Supreme Audit Office, the President of the National Bank of Poland, the Ombudsman, parliamentarians, independence campaigners and Solidarity co-founder Anna Walentynovich. The animation entitled How the President of Poland Died was created by the parliamentary group established to investigate the causes of the Tu-154M disaster of 10th of April 2010 under the guidance of Antoni Macierewicz, and was the first multimedia reconstruction of the final seconds of the government aircraft. Consultants: Professor Kazimierz Nowaczyk, coordinator of the group of technical advisors; Professor Wiesław Benienda; Dr. Wacław Boczynski, Dr. Bogdan Gajewski, Project Manager, Bartłomiej Macierewicz, Bureau Chief of the Parliamentary Group established to investigate the causes of the Tu-154M disaster of 10th of April 2010. 10th of April